You're listening to the Fibromyalgia Podcast with Tami Stackelhouse, episode 62. Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm your coach, Tami Stackelhouse. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about what to do if your family isn't supportive, particularly if your family is actively unsupportive. We'll talk about that in a minute. Before we dive into today's episode, of course, I've got our listener shout out for you, and this one comes from a listener in Canada. She says, "Hello, Tami. I've been listening to your podcast for about a year now, and I truly love it. It has really helped me deal with my fibromyalgia. Thank you for all your wisdom and support towards all of us living with fibromyalgia. Lots of love, Joni." Thank you so much for sending us this email, Joni, and thank you for letting me use your name. So shout out to you up there in Ontario, and I am so glad I was able to connect you with one of our coaches, and I can't wait to hear how you're feeling in a few months. Make sure you send me a follow-up email and let me know how you're doing. Now, as I said, today's episode is all about what to do if your family is not supportive. Now, I talk a lot in this podcast episode about my husband and my family and how supportive they've been with my fibromyalgia, but I'm very aware that not everybody has the kind of support that I have been blessed to have. And in that, there are sort of two basic camps of having families that aren't supportive. One is the more normal type of not support, which is just more a lack of communication, communicating our needs, maybe some education and understanding. And then the other camp is this is actually in a toxic relationship. This is someone who is actively being unsupportive and actually, in many ways, keeping us sick. In today's podcast episode, I'm going to be talking with Heather Kent, a registered psychotherapist, about the differences between those two things. For instance, when is it just selfishness? And when is it narcissism? When is it just somebody having a bad day? And when is it abuse? And talking about those patterns of behavior so that we can determine, is this a situation where just communicating a little bit better is maybe going to help? Or is this a situation where it's actually a toxic relationship, and if I want to heal, I need to get out of it? So let me tell you a little bit about Heather and about why I invited her to come today. I wouldn't say many of my clients, but with some of my clients, occasionally I do see someone who is in that sort of second category where they've got people in their lives that are actively being unsupportive. And whenever I end up with a client in that situation, there's really only so much I can do because fibromyalgia is very, very influenced by stress. We talk a lot in fibromyalgia about, having our fight or flight system stuck on, full speed ahead, right? We talk about sleeping with one eye open because there might be saber-toothed tigers out there, and we're stuck in this fight or flight, even though there's not really very much of a reason to be. Right? So a lot of the therapies and the techniques that we use to help bring down our symptoms are things that help to bring that fight or flight down, to help calm down our central nervous system so that it can respond in a more normal way to what's happening around us. But if you're in a situation where you're in a toxic relationship and there actually is a saber-toothed tiger in the room, there's only so much you can do to calm down that fight or flight because there's a very real reason that you are, on high all the time, high alert all the time, if you're walking around on eggshells. So in today's episode, one of the big things I asked Heather to do was help us understand. Like I said, Is this selfishness? Is this narcissism? Is this just somebody having a bad day? Is this abuse? And how to sort of differentiate. Is this a normal situation where I can, help somebody understand and become more supportive? Or is this a situation where I'm just never going to be able to get the support I need from this person? And then what do I do? So as you listen in, pay attention for that. Now, there are with those two different types of situations, I want to give you two different resources. And we'll talk about this, Heather and I talk about this in the interview that you're about to hear. The first situation where it's just more a matter of communicating more clearly, educating people about your illness, communicating your needs, I would direct you back to episode 57, where I interview Kimberly Wicks, another counselor, about how to talk with others about your fibromyalgia. She's got a lot of suggestions and resources in there on how to have those conversations if you determine that you're in a situation where it's really just a matter of education and communication. If listening to my conversation with Heather, you realize maybe there's something more to this. Maybe maybe this is a toxic relationship, or maybe this is abuse, or maybe I am dealing with a narcissist, then I would recommend you reach out to Heather directly. Heather's website will be listed in today's show notes. She also gives it during the interview. She has offered a free consultation to any of our listeners who find themselves in that situation. She has also offered her books for free as well. So just go to today's show notes, fibromyalgiapodcast.com/62, and we will have all of those resources for you, as well as how you can connect with a coach to help you with your fibromyalgia if you're needing some new ways to feel better. So with that, let me introduce you to Heather Kent. Heather is a registered psychotherapist with a training background in trauma assessment and treatment. She is the best-selling author of 2 books, Heal from Your Narcissist Ex and I Left My Toxic Relationship, Now What? Much of Heather's professional practice is focused on helping clients through the process of recovering from the trauma and PTSD of abusive relationships. Having survived her own experience in an abusive relationship, Heather soon came to realize that many other men and women find themselves in the same situation, leaving them feeling broken, ashamed, and paralyzed by fear. She's also seen with some of her clients how being in this type of a relationship makes their chronic illness symptoms worse, including, she'll talk about in this interview, a client specifically with fibromyalgia and how that affected her. Heather combines her experience from her previous teaching career with an integrative therapeutic approach to counseling. She is able to serve a larger population of clients by working with virtual programs, workshops, and retreats. And so she does work with people all over, in case you're wondering. You can reach out to her. And she helps to guide and support her clients as they navigate their way through trauma recovery from an abusive relationship and begin the next phase of their lives with safety and confidence, which is a key for us also then beginning to heal our fibromyalgia. One of the things you'll hear me say in this interview is that, fibromyalgia doesn't need to be the thing that stops you from leaving an abusive relationship, and a toxic relationship doesn't need to be the thing that keeps you from healing from your fibromyalgia. So listen in as I interview Heather Kent about what to do if your family isn't supportive. Hi, Heather. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I am so excited to talk to you today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to see you.
Yeah. So, as you know, our conversation this week is going to be around the question, what do I do if my family isn't supportive? And this is such an important question to answer, because I really think that having fibromyalgia, like you can't do it on your own. And even my single clients, have help from their community, friends, family, things like that. But when you're in a living situation where your family isn't supportive or is maybe actively unsupportive, right? Then that adds an extra layer of challenge to your health. And I know you've written a couple books kind of around this subject. So I thought you'd be a great person for us to talk to today.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. And you're so right. It is so challenging to navigate, long-term chronic illness, like in itself. And then additionally, adding in the complexity of not having people who you live with who are on board with you and in your corner and helping you kind of fight the good fight, as it were, makes it even more challenging and definitely more isolating. And incredibly stressful, I would think, as well.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely, because I mean, you've got enough on your mind and on your plate just managing yourself. And then if you've got other people that you're having to try to, juggle their own expectations or whatever, then that makes it super hard too. And then there's also the aspect of taking care of yourself means sometimes saying no to things other people want, right? So it can be incredibly challenging. Now, I know that you and I have talked about some clients that you've had with fibromyalgia. So, why don't you just share a little bit about what you saw working with that particular person or those clients?
Yeah, so I've had a couple of clients with fibromyalgia and other chronic illness like rheumatoid arthritis, which can be quite debilitating as well in different ways. But one specific client who was diagnosed with fibromyalgia went through a real struggle with absolutely feeling like she was a burden on her family, and she was just the most inconvenient person. And her needs were an annoyance. It was very obvious that her partner, her husband, was completely in denial or not wanting to acknowledge that she had these limitations. And so, she shared a couple of stories with me. One being when this one time they went to like a theme park and she had to use a wheelchair, and of course, he didn't want her to have to use one because he didn't want to have to be stuck pushing her, for example. And so when it was clear that she needed it, he was very irritated and kind of aggressive with it. And, when he wanted to go off into a store or whatever and she needed to be parked, like he got frustrated and just pushed her out into the middle of the street or whatever, and just left her there because she was just so annoyed that she needed, that he was being slowed down or hindered by what he wanted to do. That's just kind of one little example, but a very public one where she was humiliated and really made to feel, and she really internalized that feeling of being, unwanted and being a burden and being so inconvenient and, making someone else's life miserable. And so, with the question, what do I do when my family members aren't supportive? I think it's important to kind of look at the level of like non-support. So how unsupportive are we talking? Are we talking about like it's a bit of a communication issue and they just don't understand what you're going through and they need more information maybe? Or is it, that they just feel like it's too hard for them to do it because it's, something they don't know how to handle, and so they just do nothing because they don't know what to do? Or is it blatant, I am inconvenienced by your, you know, limitations, and I am going to make you feel bad about that on a regular basis.
Right. Right. So what are some ways to sort of diagnose that, right? Like I know that for me, just thinking about, bringing my husband along. We were only about 6 months married when I was diagnosed. So we were both kind of learning at the same time. And I know a lot of it felt like one thing, but was really another, right? Like it felt like he's parking way out here in this parking lot, just to make me have to walk farther. And it really was because he just like, it was all new to all of us, right? We're still trying to figure it out. So can you give us some guidance on how to know, is this something that's purposefully being done? Is this a lack of communication, maybe even on my part? Like, how do I know?
So I think first trying to having a conversation as like a little bit of a litmus test would be a good place to start. So if you're feeling like you're not sure whether it's like more purposeful or just, ignorance for just not knowing, then you might want to say like, look, I know that you know that I have this, but you know, do you know what that really means? Like, what does that mean to you knowing that I have this? And see what they say, and if they say, I don't really know what that means, then that would be an invitation, I think, for us to give them more information. So, what it means for me is I am limited in XYZ ways. Or ye, I'm Canadian.
Yep.
And so, and it means that the things that I used to be able to do that you maybe remember me being able to do with no problem are no longer easy for me to do. And that is an adjustment for me. And I think it's an adjustment that you don't realize that I have to make. And so, and then seeing how that information is received. If it's received from a place of, oh, okay, like, thank you for sharing. What can we do to make things easier? Like, how do we like problem solve this? Then that was kind of a communication issue, right? And so it's really important to make sure that they understand what your diagnosis means in terms of your specific, because these things are also very like specific to each person's immune system and all of those things, right? So one person's fibromyalgia symptoms might be different from another's. Limitations could be varying. It's all about a spectrum, right? I think of symptoms, right? And so just kind of making sure that they know what those severity symptoms are, what those changes mean, how frustrating it is for you too to be limited by things that you used to be able to do, just so that they can kind of see it. And then if it's dismissed as you overreacting or looking for attention or, making things out to be a bigger deal than they really are, or that you have to, suck it up and just deal with it, then we're looking at a different conversation, I think, a very different conversation. So this is not just a simple misunderstanding or misinformation or miscommunication. This is more blatant abusive behavior and kind of aggressive behavior towards things not being what they want them to be, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yep, definitely. I was also thinking while you were talking about the fact that it's important to have this conversation not when you're in the middle of what's happening, right? Like, don't have this on a high pain day with lots of brain fog. Wait until you feel a little bit better and you're out of the situation and then have the conversation.
For sure. And like sometimes we get really wrapped up in the emotion of that moment or whatever's happening. And then I always tell people when I'm doing like couples kind of work, it's like, okay, when you can feel yourself heightened, when you can feel that you're not, your full kind of true self, that's when we have to take a literal time out and say, okay, let's time out this conversation. Let's put it on the shelf, but we're going to come back to this at a specific date and time so that you absolutely know that this conversation is going to be continued, but it's going to be at this time later when maybe you're feeling better. So maybe tomorrow afternoon, when you maybe afternoons are typically your better time of day. So you choose a time and you specifically say this is when we're going to keep talking about this when we're both more able to engage, and then you go back to it. because then you're not going to be caught up in not just the pain, like you said, in the brain fog, but also the like, emotions and the hurt and whatever might be happening in that moment. So scheduling it for later is really important because you know then it won't be kind of swept under the rug, as sometimes these things tend to happen.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think sometimes we do the sweeping too, right? Because what with fibromyalgia, stress definitely makes our symptoms worse. And these are stressful conversations, right? So I know there were many times where I was like, I just don't want to talk about that because that's actually going to make me feel worse, even though in the long term, getting the support that I needed and things like that would help, right?
But initially, it's like, oh, it doesn't feel good.
Right, right. Exactly, exactly.
We keep going and we keep going and we keep on keeping on, to keep the peace. And again, that's another kind of circling back to your question of like, how do you know what's really going on? Well, if you're looking in terms of like sort of toxic situation, um, are you often walking on eggshells? Do you feel like it's stressful to just be yourself and let loose and let yourself feel the things that you need to feel? Do you feel like you are an inconvenience, like my client did? Do you feel like you're always having to kind of predict another person's behavior and kind of mitigate that and minimize that as much as possible? And so that's a really big indicator that there's something bigger than just not understanding your situation. And again, turning to more of that toxic end of things. So, if you're being belittled, if you're being degraded, if you're being blamed, and if you are, constantly wondering what kind of mood they're going to be in, what's going to set them off, this is a much bigger issue, I think, that needs to be acknowledged and addressed because you're never going to get the support from that person, unless there's some significant shifting on their end, which again, you have to look at, okay, how likely are they to recognize that this is abusive? How likely are they to recognize that this is not okay? How likely are they to recognize perhaps I need some help? And then go and actually do it. So, and I think these are scary things to think about because we don't want to acknowledge maybe that we're in these situations. I know that I certainly ignored a lot of the warning signs and red flags when I was in an abusive relationship. But also knowing what that leads to, in addition to like the fibromyalgia, being in an abusive relationship is going to compound that stress and make the symptoms all the more severe and difficult to manage.
I know there have been a couple of people that I've talked to, and this doesn't happen all the time, but it has happened a couple of times where, I'll be talking to somebody about ways that they can improve their fibromyalgia, and it really becomes clear to me that the thing they need to do is get out of a bad situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as soon as that happens, even though the idea of that is incredibly scary and it feels again like, really lonely and isolating and no one understands my experience, um, being on the other side of that is like it's really amazing because the body wraps trauma too, right? And so there's a whole field of research around people with chronic illness, like fibromyalgia, like chronic fatigue syndrome, autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis and these types of disorders. A lot of these situations are strongly linked to trauma. And so when we are in a traumatic situation and we are continuing to expose ourselves and we've been exposed to trauma over a long period of time, our bodies like have nowhere to put that. And so we absorb that. It's in our cells and it has these memories, these traumatic memories. And so all of these things are very tied together. And when people are newly removed from the situation that was causing so much distress, it's really miraculous to see how their symptoms start to improve.
Mhm. Definitely. It can be an absolute game changer, but getting from here to there is can be really, really tough, right? So, one of the things I really like to do on this podcast is make sure we're all on the same page as we throw around, different words and terms, right? So, we've talked about toxic relationships, we've talked about, is this possibly abuse? I know one of the terms that gets thrown around a lot with all of this is narcissism, right? And sometimes that word has sort of become a synonym to just selfishness, but that's an actual real like separate thing from selfishness. Right. So why don't we just because of your background and experience and area of expertise, why don't we define some of these terms so that people have a clear understanding of what they may or may not be dealing with?
Oh, absolutely. One of the common misconceptions, and I'll start with the word abuse, and then we'll go into selfishness and narcissism after, if that's okay. Um, so one of the biggest misconceptions that many people have, especially women, and as I did, was the concept that abuse had to be physical. And so if I'm not being beaten, if I don't have scars and bruises and cuts to show what's happening, then I'm not experiencing abuse. And this is so out of line with reality of what abuse means. And unfortunately, it is this societal norm. And the legal system recognizes abuse only along these very limiting terms of physical violence. And I would argue that physical violence does not exist without psychological abuse behind it. And so it's the other abuse that you don't have the visible scars and bruises that is more damaging. Your body, physical body, heals from those things, but your emotional state, your mental state, and all of these things have much deeper wounds, and it's much more difficult to heal those things. And so the common misconception that people have when they are in abusive relationships is, well, I'm not being hit, so I must not be in an abusive relationship. And this is very inaccurate. And so, what you're looking at, what does abuse look like? Well, there's various different types of abuse. So, we've got, like I said, psychological abuse kind of encompasses emotional abuse and financial abuse, where the other person in the relationship is controlling the money and the finances. Maybe they don't want you to work. Maybe you can't work because of your limitations too, and therefore you're dependent, as my client was dependent on her husband for the finances, and he absolutely controlled her and like threatened her with finances on a regular basis. And so that was really scary for her, and it made her feel like she could never leave. It made her feel trapped as well. But we found out that that's not actually the case, and she was able to get out of that situation. But this is one way in which they maintain control. So what abuse really is control over another person and having power and control over you. And so, what does that look like? It doesn't have to be physical violence or sexual assault, um, but it absolutely is emotional and psychological abuse, and sometimes financial abuse too. And so, like I mentioned before, like it usually goes into this cycle. So you may have heard of something called the cycle of abuse, where there's like these stages. And so, you have the honeymoon phase where everything is great and they're really kind and they're apologetic to whatever it is that they did to you, and they're sorry, they're not going to do it again, everything's going to be great, they give you presents, they take you out to dinner, whatever. And then they fall back into the pattern of behavior, which is maybe ignoring you or downplaying your needs, or degrading you or making you feel like you are inconvenient, or you're overreacting and you're too sensitive and you need to get on with it. Um, and then they could be possibly just ignore you and be totally cold and kind of like discarding you and tossing you off to the side really neglecting you in terms of, emotional connection and that sort of thing. So these are kind of the different sort of stages. And then if you look at specific personality disorder abuse, like such as narcissism, for example, um, the kind of hallmark of a narcissistic personality versus selfishness or like some tendencies, right? Um, is the lack of empathy. And so, really looking at your partner and asking yourself, does this person have the ability to contemplate and consider other people's feelings? Does this even enter their stream of consciousness when they make decisions? So, in people who with narcissistic personality disorder, many of which are undiagnosed, I might add, because it's a whole other level of like total denial, inability to take accountability for their actions, take responsibility for what they do and what they say, blaming everybody else, gaslighting, that kind of thing. And so, but the real hallmark is that they just don't factor in anyone else when they make decisions. And it doesn't even cross their minds how what they do or say could impact someone else, nor do they care how it would impact someone else. And so the only thing that matters is what their gains are going to be, what their benefits are. And and it doesn't matter how what they do impacts anybody else. Even if they could get there and understand it, it still wouldn't influence their decision. They do it anyway because it's all about what they can get out of the situation. And so if you are, not giving them anything that's useful to them, then they have no need for you. And so it's all a very like, yeah, insidious sort of twisted thing because you are remembering all these wonderful times that you had in that time when he was really kind and you guys connected and he seemed so attentive and understanding and this was so wonderful. And so you're just really trying to do whatever you can desperately get back to that space, which is why we sometimes do the walking on eggshells, trying to mitigate, explosiveness and making sure that nothing that they is being done to possibly set them off. And so we do these things to try and, keep the peace and keep things smooth sailing. But really, this is, enabling them to continue their kind of power and control because, we don't want to have conflict. And so this is kind of what abuse looks like across the spectrum. Of course, it is a spectrum, and so selfishness is very different from narcissism. And again, it really goes back to the empathy piece. So someone who's selfish, you know, might have a hard time initially if you point out that they're being selfish because their ego kind of gets in the way. But over time, if they have time to chew on it, they might get to that eventually and say, yeah, you know what, you're right. I'm sorry. And they can understand and feel bad about what they did. They have some kind of remorse at some point, which is what sets them apart from a narcissistic personality or a sociopathic personality where empathy and understanding or considering other people is just not on the menu at all.
Mhm. Mhm. Now, I know, I was thinking when you were talking about abuse in a similar way to, like, selfishness and narcissism, um, I think we all have bad days, and we all have, like, moments where that one particular action that we took might be considered abusive, and so I think it's, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but what we're looking for is more a pattern of things more than
Pattern of
just like a
behavior.
one-off.
Yeah, pattern of behavior for sure. There's one really explosive thing that happened and they just flew off the handle and it was terrifying, justifiably. But that's kind of the only time you really ever saw that. Okay, so like you can kind of work through that and come back to that and figure out what the heck happened and how do we not make that happen again, right? Um, but this is more of a pattern of behavior and these sort of cycles too you're looking for. So, when I feel like I need to leave, or I start to pull away, or I start to feel disconnected, then they kind of come back and suck you back in. We call this hoovering. And so hoovering, right, which is like the vacuum cleaner, with that, back to that kind of love bombing, idealizing honeymoon sort of stuff, right? Just enough to keep you on the hook. And then round and around the cycle we go again. Yeah. And it's really hard to see it when you're in the middle of it, especially when you're trying to navigate your own, chronic illness, because you've got other things to focus on as well. So it's really, really hard to see when you're in the middle of it.
Mhm. Definitely, definitely. Now, you talked about financial abuse, and I have to say I have never actually heard that term before until talking to you today, but I totally can see that, and I think with a chronic illness, wow, what a scary opportunity there is for that, right? Because I imagine that also looks like, use the example of not working or controlling the finances there. But I think that also extends to our getting better, right? Like controlling whether or not we can pay for certain treatments.
Yeah, and in the United States, that's a big consideration as for sure. Not as much here because everything's universal. Um, and so you kind of get the care that's available, but you might have to wait, kind of thing, right? You get on a wait list.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, like certainly in the United States, where there's so many more, I think, opportunities for specialized treatment, new treatment, that kind of thing, which is fantastic. But again, you have to have the ability to access those services. And so, if you don't have financial independence, for whatever reason, and you have to convince your partner that this is what's needed to help you get better or feel better, or be able to manage your symptoms in a way that allows you to function as much as possible, that's another whole way that they can control you and make sure that that they have control over your wellness.
Right. Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
The whole other layer there, absolutely. And one that we don't see it as much, like I said, in Canada, just because the healthcare system is so different. But like in terms of being able to, you know, move out on your own and get the care that you need and that sort of stuff, it is absolutely a consideration, and it takes sort of a planning to figure out how am I going to, sort of protect myself when I don't have financial independence necessarily in that moment, in that relationship, in that time, as a result of whether it's medical or at the behest of my partner, right?
Right. Right. Exactly. So I know one of the things that a lot of people in this situation run into, if they get to the point where they know they're in a toxic relationship, and this may be family members that don't live with you, right? It's like it's my mom or whatever, whoever it is. It's like, shouldn't I have that person in my life? Well, no, you don't have to. Right. But how do we take those steps, especially if I see this a lot with my clients who are have the more symptomatic they are, sometimes the more they need to leave a situation, right? Because it is contributing to their feeling bad,
It's
right?
exacerbating their symptoms, and maybe even bringing on new ones too, right? And so, and it can become progressively worse over time, as I mentioned, because we are like exposed to this source of trauma over the long period. And so the longer that we are dealing with it, we can't heal from it because we're constantly in survival mode every single day. And so, healing work can't really ever happen when you're still with the abusive person, because you're constantly being re-traumatized like on a regular basis, right? So when you're being re-traumatized, and I think trauma too is another word that we might need to sort of chat more about. Um, when we're being re-traumatized on a daily basis, our bodies don't have a chance to ever kind of hit the reset button.
Mhm. Definitely, definitely. So yeah, I think trauma is a good word to define there, because I think a lot of times trauma is in the eye of the person who's experiencing it, right? Like you and I could go through two very similar things, and it might be traumatic to me and it might not be to you.
Absolutely. And so a trauma is anything that kind of jars you from your regular ability to do daily functioning. So if you have intrusive thoughts, if you have things that you're fixated on, things that wake you up at night, things that make it hard for you to fall asleep, things that you relive in your mind as if they're happening to you again because something reminded you of an event that happened in the past. And so these are sort of very common symptoms of what experiencing trauma looks like. And so sometimes people can experience just one traumatic thing one time and they don't develop any of these longer term symptoms from it. They get over it. So we call this an acute trauma because it's like, you know, my dog died kind of thing, um, in a tragic way. And maybe that was really awful. But maybe that experience was awful for a few weeks and then you recovered from it and everything was okay. But you might have something that happens that is continuing to bring up, reliving that event or not being able to function well because your memories or your thoughts are being kind of interrupted by this event. And so we look at like traumatic memory and we look at flashbacks, we look at nightmares, we look at difficulty sleeping, changes in appetite. We look at, heightened feelings of fear and, anxiety or depression, these types of symptoms. And so when we have a presence of those things, that's how we know that we have experienced a trauma that we haven't recovered from. And so and so when we're being exposed to the source of that trauma, for example, in a toxic or abusive relationship or with a narcissist or whatever, you're with someone who is triggering that response every single day. And so your nervous system, like the autonomic nervous system, is constantly on high alert all the time, hypervigilant, looking for danger, trying to protect you, trying to look out for you. Meanwhile, your symptoms are, skyrocketing through the roof because you just can't relax and your nervous system doesn't let you because, we're under attack, right? The saber-toothed tigers are chasing us out of the cave kind of thing, right? And that's really what's happening is that we're putting ourselves in front of the tiger every day. So how can we like calm down from being chased when it's a daily experience?
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
makes
Yep. Yep, definitely. So what do we do? What are some actions that we can take if we determine this is indeed a toxic relationship of some kind? If it's somebody at home or even friends or family members that we don't live with.
Yeah, so and this isn't an answer that most people really like to hear. Because it means that you have like some tough decisions to make. But like if you look at the research, it is unanimous across the board of psychologists, psychiatrists, like neurosurgeons, like neurologists. All of these people are in agreement, therapists, social workers, that in order to heal from the trauma caused by a toxic person, we must eliminate that toxic person from our lives. Now, that may not be completely 100% possible, say, if you share children with that person, as an example. However, you can cut them out of your life as much as humanly possible with very specific um, strategies of communication that are going to minimize your exposure and minimize the ability of that person to continue to abuse you in the ways that they have. And so that's a lot of the work that I do is around understanding what people went through, understanding what abuse looks like, understanding what are your symptoms of PTSD. And this is another thing that people don't realize that they've been living with PTSD most of the time. And I get to think, oh, PTSD is just for soldiers who came back from Iraq or Afghanistan. Absolutely not. And like I said, PTSD comes from not being able to continue life without being, intruded on by these feelings, experiences, thoughts, etc. And so that's what PTSD is like decreased ability to function as a result of something you went through. And so looking at what those symptoms are, and then, okay, how do I manage those? How do I minimize those? How do I hopefully eliminate those? But we can't eliminate those when we're constantly being re-triggered every single day by the person in our lives. So even if it's, say, like, I work with a lot of people who have like narcissistic parents, for example. So they don't live with them anymore as adults, but there's still this sort of need to please them or desire to get their approval, or this obligation that they feel as a result of the control and guilt that is being played by the narcissistic parent. And so we look at, okay, like, we have, just because they're your family doesn't mean that you get to condone or subject yourself to abusive behavior. And so learning of important things like boundaries and assertiveness are really hard to do, but so incredibly empowering and so incredibly freeing from this toxic cycle that you've been in for who knows how many years with whomever the person might be in your life. And then you can actually have space and brain capacity to focus on your healing, not just your psychological healing, but your physical healing from your fibromyalgia, from whatever chronic illness that you're managing. We don't have ability to focus when we're trying to survive day to day, when our nervous system thinks that we're being attacked, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. The space that you're talking about. I mean, I had the image of the saber-toothed tigers chasing us, around. And it's like, you don't have time to like think about anything else with that.
No, that's all there is. You're just like, you're in like fight, flight, freeze, like fawn mode. That's it. Like, your nervous system activates those lower parts of your brain, and like the alarm bells go off. Danger,
Yeah.
danger.
Right. Right. Now, I imagine that this is pretty hard to do all by yourself.
I absolutely agree. In fact, I would say that I wouldn't say impossible, but pretty much, because you can't see it clearly either. It's really hard to see it when you're in it and when you're trying to extract yourself from it. And so you need a support network of some kind. And so, what you've developed, Tammy, and like your support system with other people who are suffering and struggling, and you're like, the work you do is so amazing. And so, like, you provide that place of support and community for others, or people who are dealing with living with fibromyalgia. And so similarly, you want to be looking for ways to find support for your trauma recovery, right? And so you're looking at, obviously, therapy of some kind, because you want someone who's got trauma background, trauma training, someone who understands abusive relationships, who understands kind of what that cycle looks like, what the symptoms are. And then being in a community with other, which is what I love the work that I do, is because so many of the women that I work with feel so alone. They feel so incredibly isolated, and they felt as if they've been going crazy for the last however many years because of being exposed to someone who's telling them that they're crazy, right? You're overreacting. overreacting. You're too much. You're annoying. Nobody likes you. You need to stop talking. You need to stop complaining. What it is. This is your fault. I never did that. That never happened. You misremembered. You're too sensitive. You're too hormonal. That's my favorite. Estrogen, right?
Blame it on the girly things.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, like, right? And so being told this repeatedly for so long, like you do start to question your reality. You do start to wonder whether it's you. You do start to wonder whether you're overreacting or like whatever, whether you're making up your symptoms, all of these things. And so it's really hard because you can't see that that's the abuse, right? And it's so insidious and slowly it increases and kind of evolves over time too. I always say to people, if the person you're with behaved this way on date number one, say if it's a partner, you would run for the hills. You wouldn't book the second date,
Right.
right? But it's not that way. And so, because a lot of people carry shame and guilt around being in these relationships. And why did I stay so long? And why couldn't I see this? And, or why did I go back? And so, in cases like me, I left and then I got sucked back in. And so, but it's because it's so insidious and they're master manipulators and they're very good at what they do. And it has nothing to do with what's wrong with you. It has everything to do with what's wrong with them. And so that's a big piece of like working through it as well. But providing other women with this sense of community from women who have been through it too is so incredibly validating after years of so much invalidation from the family member or the partner or whoever it is in your life who you thought was supposed to be a support person, but really they're sabotaging you the whole time. Showing up with other people who understand because they've lived through it is just so incredibly empowering and so validating and so lovely to do because then everyone kind of gets to go through their healing journey together. And so it's this community. And so to answer your question,